Bonjour tout le monde, welcome to another episode of the Point of No Return podcast. On this week's show, I had the pleasure of speaking with Alik Sokolov, co-founder and CEO at Responsibly. If you're curious about AI, I highly recommend that you listen to this episode because it does not disappoint. Alik studied math, he has a master's and a PhD in the field, and is currently building, which seems to be one of the coolest companies, at least in the investment world, using AI, right? So their company called Responsibly is helping investors make responsible decisions guided by AI. And so we start the conversation talking about Alik's, education, how he got into studying like high level math, and then of course all these latest developments in the world of artificial intelligence, what he thinks about ChatGPT, the fascinating possibilities, and then of course we talked about his startup Responsibly and what you're doing, the big vision. We talked about a lot about quant investing, and you can see Alik really knows his stuff and has an interesting view on where he wants to take his company with a bold vision. I really enjoyed my conversation with Alik. I hope that you enjoy today's conversation. Alik, it's such a pleasure to have you on. I know we've been trying to find some time to connect, and like obviously we're going to talk a lot about what you're doing at Responsibly and really cool startup and really interesting work that you guys are doing. But I want to start maybe first with your past and a bit of your education, right? Because I've seen that you've done multiple degrees, including a doctorate in mathematics, right? So for me, the kind of the foundation of AI obviously is computer science, but there's math, right? So lead us to maybe to why did you want to do a PhD in math? What led you down that path?
I took a bit of an interesting journey, right? Because I've always studied math, right? So my undergrad, I graduated back in 2013, was in financial mathematics, or the U of T program was called Mathematical Application of Economics and Finance. Um, Always kind of had an interest in it, but I actually out of undergrad I did go straight to work. So I went to Deloitte, did data science there. So it was an interesting place. I spent quite a bit of time there. I was there for 6 years because I got to do kind of work as a hands-on data scientist, but also work with a lot of different businesses, do the management consulting stuff, and it was a really great place to learn. I Because I was doing machine learning, I kind of felt that it was important to further my education. So I did a master's a couple of years after I started there, and actually I stayed at Deloitte. So I did my master's full time while I was there. And then when I did my master's, I was like, you know what, I'm done. That was a pretty hellish experience. If I'm honest, would not recommend it. I was, really burnt out by then. I was like, I think this is good. I don't need any more education. Like I already know my stuff. But then, a few more years passed. I developed an interest in applying some of the things that I was doing at work, especially the deep learning stuff, so natural language processing, just deep learning models in general, and applying that to problems in finance, and specifically around ESG and responsible investing. So I actually started writing papers. So just on the side, working in consulting, then later on working in venture capital, and ended up just having 4 or 5 publications or so. And then when the pandemic started, I was working in venture capital, and I started thinking seriously about starting the business, and also about going back for my PhD. And I kind of did both at the same time. Basically, went back to the University of Toronto, started my PhD, got all my coursework done, got a couple more papers published, and then started the company around the same time. So I started my PhD back in September 2019, and then started Responsibly, kind of in earnest when I finished all my coursework or actually, sorry, 2020, September 2020 is when I started my PhD, and then early 2021 is when I, really started working on the business and trying to make it a real thing, grow it, etc.
Very cool, man. Very cool background. Maybe before we talk about response, maybe unpack the mathematics piece. First of all, I can relate to burning out doing a master's. I didn't do a PhD, but also was working full time at a digital agency when I did my master's, and nearly killed me. I lost a relationship
Mhm.
because of it. So it was very, 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 very tough time, but happy I did it. On the math front, right? So maybe unpack what is AI, right? Like, so because for me, there's again, I'm a complete novice in this field, but from what I understand, there's this huge mathematics component to it. So
Mhm.
maybe just unpack at a high level how you see it.
Yeah. So, to kind of get the most pedantic way of defining it would be to say, well, like artificial intelligence is really a really broad field. And, in the 80s or something, when you had, these Pac-Man machines, right, where you could play Pac-Man and you had these ghosts chasing you, right? Those ghosts would be governed by AIs. Because they had a set of rules and they had some sort of behavior to figure out how to optimally or simplistically chase you across the game board. Um, but what happened as the field of AI evolved is so there was a lot of excitement when computers started getting fast. And people really felt like we would build these systems using rules and these symbolic AI systems where kind of with enough knowledge and enough human knowledge distilled into simple rules that are easy to program, we would be able to get really complex behavior from these AI systems. That was the initial hypothesis. And that didn't work at all. We went through this long period called the AI winter, where symbolic systems, um, we discovered that they weren't scalable. And machine learning was really the key to unlocking artificial intelligence, moving on to, when deep learning started becoming really powerful since 2013, computer vision, then natural language processing, making more and more rapid progress. And now we basically had, a big step change in terms of this progress where things that felt like they were years out in terms of really generalizing artificial intelligence seemingly are now arriving, and all bets are off sort of in terms of how things will progress from here, how quickly we will get to that stage where we really are having these systems that we can in earnest called AGIs, these artificial general intelligences, where um, the a computer system can really exhibit the kind of behaviors where it becomes difficult to argue that we as humans can do something in terms of our reasoning ability that computers can do. Doesn't mean that they're unequivocally better, but it probably does mean that there will not be a ton of stuff left that we can point to and say, well, I can look at an image and figure out why an image is funny, right? Like that was one of the really cool things from the GPT-4 demo that OpenAI did recently. Where does mathematics come into all of this? Well, there's a couple sources of progress that are the most important, right? So progress in terms of computational power is, of course, very important for developing our artificial intelligence systems. We are very reliant on really maxing out the computational limits of what we have available in order to create these, the most powerful and incredible models. Getting a lot of data through. So we just wrote down a lot of stuff and put it on the internet, and turns out that it was a very important source of progress for artificial intelligence. And then the last part is algorithmic, right? So really figuring out how can we create the kind of algorithms that can scale, and make for these very powerful models. Things like scaling laws, right? So what are the optimal trade-offs between computational budgets we have available and the size of our models and the amount of training data that they can consume? The interplay between mathematics and artificial intelligence, though, is interesting. Machine learning is kind of a purely empirical field. So, in some ways, when it comes to math, you also have this sort of relationship, kind of like physics and mathematics, right? And that's sort of a joke for nerdy people, right? Where you know physicists discover some law, and then mathematicians years later prove why that was like an okay thing to do mathematically, and sort of it was mathematically legal, right? um, and there is a little bit of that, right? There's certain things that are happening now with large language models that we don't fully understand. Like empirically we can tell that they have certain emergent behaviors, emergent properties that are quite surprising, um, that mean that they're basically able to do more things than probably anyone could have anticipated, and it's not fully clear why. I wrote a piece for the Fields magazine recently where basically there's a couple of open problems that I think mathematicians can really tackle, to potentially help accelerate AI progress, potentially help us understand things like alignment or AI safety a little bit better, right? So how do we align AI models to be more close to what humans want, or what humans' values are, or you know social good? And those are going to be huge interesting topics that I think mathematics would have a big role to play in. But me, I'm an applied mathematician, right? So I am much more on the applied side. Like how can we engineer something to get it to work? And there, mathematics is super helpful because you develop a really good quantitative intuition, right? So it becomes easier to absorb kind of new information on these topics and say, okay, well, there's a new paper that proposes some kind of architectural change, and I have something to relate it to, right? So, information theoretic concepts like entropy, or some computational scaling ideas that make it easier to understand. Okay, intuitively, why would this work? And is this something that can be incorporated into our workflow? Is this a model that may be useful to solve a problem on our end as well?
Yeah, it's fascinating. It's fascinating. It's like I said, it's the from the outsider's perspective, you see this progress, and it seems to be following this pretty exponential curve, right? You mentioned this the kind of three foundations of
Mhm.
like compute, data, and then the algorithms. Do you foresee progress continuing at the same rate? Like, like the kind of like the huge jump from GPT-3 to GPT-4, or are we hitting any constraints soon?
Mhm.
Right, like the amount of data, of course, is growing pretty quickly. The amount of compute is limited by just the laws of physics, I imagine, right, in computer chips. But it seems like the algorithms can always get smarter, right? We can, adjust weights better, make those improvements there. So I'd be curious to hear you on where the natural constraints will come in the future, if
There are
any.
definitely improvements to be had in all three of those areas, right? So, chips are always getting faster, right? There is kind of natural progress happening by, with Nvidia, for example. There are also a lot of companies that are working on more energy efficient chips that maybe will be, kind of a step change in terms of our ability to maybe not train these models, but at least do inference on them, and open up their aperture to make large language models more accessible and cheaper to use. On the data front, it's actually a really kind of interesting question, and it's pretty deep. If you look at it naively, it seems like we are kind of hitting limits in terms of just basically all of the data that we wrote down ever and put on the internet dictates how large of a language model you can train. Right. So that's something that's called scaling laws for large language models. There's a paper from about a year ago called Chinchilla that really explored what these scaling rules are. Like if you have a fixed compute budget and how some amount of data, how big of a model can you train so that you're using your compute budget effectively. And actually it seems like a lot of our early models were oversized. So when OpenAI, for example, trained GPT-3, the family of models that was used to power the initial version of ChatGPT, GPT 3.5, those models were just way bigger than was optimal with the compute budgets we had. But on the other hand, we only have so much data on the internet where, like, probably the biggest or large language models that we can justify are kind of in the 500 billion to 1 trillion parameter range, which is sort of the biggest ones that have been published so far. Like Palm by Google was 540 billion parameters. And if you really go out of your way to try to get all of the data that exists, and you have a lot of compute, you're probably going to end up somewhere roughly at that range of that parameter size. On the other hand, folks at OpenAI, like Ilya Sutskever, he has been saying that, what, like, we're actually not feeling data constrained right now. There is kind of an order of magnitude more to go in terms of data that we can access for training. I'm not so sure where the data would be coming from. So it's a bit of an open question, right? How big of a large language model can we scale effectively? But my guess would be the next progress will not come from make the model bigger. It will come from other things. So making the architectures more efficient, changing how we fine tune. Um, when we create a large language model, it's essentially a two-step process. There's a pre-training process, right? So the large language model is trained. It's a next word prediction machine, right, or next token prediction machine to be technical, right? So all it's doing is it says, okay, well, like, we have all of this data on the internet. That data has some kind of structure to it, right? So if you're reading a bunch of random sentences and you block out the next word and you try to predict what it is, in order to get good at that next word prediction game, you need to develop skills, right? So you need to develop a model of the world so that if a cat jumped, or like you have a sentence like a sheep jumped over a fence, is probably a pretty likely word, right? And I know that because I have the word, some kind of world model, and the sheep is probably in an enclosure, and so that's probably where fences are, and probably a sheep is jumping over it, right? And it turns out that because we have so much data and because of the scale of these models, indeed they do develop world models through this kind of pre-training scheme. But if you just do that, you get a model that's not very useful. It's not very usable. It's not a great product. No one wants to use it. It's very hard to get something useful out of it. So it's like it has this like wealth of information in this context, but it's stuck in this mode of predicting the next word. So to get it to produce some useful output for you is actually not so easy. And so this is where fine tuning comes in. And this is where OpenAI developed a big edge on its competition, seemingly. they got really, really good at this fine tuning process, right? So, they're kind of famous reinforcement learning from human feedback research. And this is really what made ChatGPT so good. ChatGPT initially was using a language model that at that point was a few years old, but they got really, really good at aligning from human feedback, and they were able to fine tune it to draw out all of this latent knowledge and these latent skills into a product that was very useful. And then again, there was a huge jump from 3.5 to GPT-4, where they then showed, and by the way, this model can also get really, really good at things like propositional logic. And so do really good on the LSAT, for example. And the LSAT is basically a glorified IQ test, right? At least in its language sections. Um, how they did it is less clear, right? Because now it's all competitive, and they're trying to maintain their edge. I would suspect it has a lot to do with how much data they were able to collect from ChatGPT logs, which might have created a nice moat for them that'll make it difficult for others to catch up. But I think eventually others will. There won't be a single game in town. But as of right now, the kind of stuff GPT-4 can do as a user, it's pretty incredible, pretty mind blowing. And it's in a lot of ways, in my opinion, it's already at a place where it's doing way more than I would have thought would be possible, in the next decade. But now we're there, and even if we don't have another like big step change like we did in the last year, I think incredible things will still happen. Because at this point, even if it's just using GPT-4 and doing engineering on top of it to create plugins for it, to create industry specific solutions using this technology, it's already transformative. Um, I don't even know what a big step change at this point would be. I think at this point, if we just proceed sort of in like linear progress and just things like what we have available today, it's already world changing, and it will improve still, right? There'll still be more improvements on the foundational technology.
Yeah, it's an endlessly fascinating topic, and I could book you more in it. I want to talk about responsibility, maybe just to bounce a couple of points on what you just mentioned, right? So this notion of like learning by human reinforcement, right? Like what OpenAI kind of like pioneered. I find that an interesting topic, right? And kind of
Mhm.
interesting of like man plus machine is better. That I find is an interesting concept. And to your point of like, well, we've just invented fire. It feels like so. It's like I think we're good for a bit. It's like I don't think there needs to be this kind of like next breakthrough, at least in the next like it seems like there was a few months where it was all breaking through, but now we've kind of hit the new normal with air quotes. And we're already seeing people fall in love with with like tools like Replica and all these things. So it's like we're just opening up and there was bugs. So I really like that point. Let's talk about Responsibly, right? Which is
Mhm.
obviously your startup that you co-founded in this world. So maybe just the first question for the audience is what is your company? What do you guys do?
Mm. So we do AI for investment research. Essentially, we have a strong focus on responsible investing, or ESG, but really our technology is broader than that, right? So it's really all about accelerating the research process for a human investor, right? So um, the asset management, right, or investment research, it's one of those jobs where for a long time it was something that it's difficult to use AI for, right? Because markets are highly competitive. Things are, shifting constantly, right? So of course, you have the field of quantitative finance, and that's an entire field, and people do, real stuff in that space. But in terms of assets under management, quant finance really is a fraction of investment that's being done by humans. And really philosophically, it kind of lives on the margin, right? So basically, like quants, right? They really deal at these like small mispricing, right? So so like there's some idea where maybe across a lot of securities you can identify some small probabilistic edge, right? Or maybe you can identify some real hard bias and some kind of consistent large mispricing. But really it's still living on the margin of like humans do the majority of investing, and they set prices, and then you look for inefficiency in the process, right? Like that's sort of the entire philosophy. And the reason why humans did the bulk of the work is that really finance is their like a great example of a general intelligence job, right? Like what investors do, it's complex. They look far into the future. They're synthesizing a lot of different information together that's really unstructured to try to come up with an idea. Okay, like how is this company going to perform over the next few years time horizon, right? And even if someone's a little bit more short term, answering the question of like, hey, is this company going to beat its earnings or not? Of course, you have the baseline AI, forecasting type of work, but really, it's a place where if you are going to have a big edge, um, historically, a human is the one that was going to generate that edge, right? The funds that perform the best, funds like Citadel, for example, right? Like for the most part, the way they're structured, these desks are really solid humans who are technology enabled, but are there, creating investment ideas quarter over quarter to understand, which company is going to under or perform relative to a peer on their earnings, right? um, in order to aid the human, though, you can speed up a lot of the research that they do, right? So there's a lot of spots where it's like looking for something in a company disclosure to understand some question on like what it like how consistent is the company's management around actually delivering on what they will say they will do, for example, right? Like that sort of information is very difficult to structure. Sort of historically we would rely on humans to do that. So I started Responsibly with this idea that okay, there's like so much research that people are doing that we now have the technology to really really speed up, right? So you can't remove humans completely from this process, but you can certainly take the 50 hours a week they spend doing this stuff and turn it into 30, right? And that's a very realistic goal that because of how much kind of humans and monies in the space, right, is both the lucrative one and also frees up people to hopefully do more useful stuff. And by the way, when it comes to responsible investing, if you can really show humans that these non-financial risks, like somebody being terrible to their employees or somebody having a poor record of product safety, are actually things that they should be looking to incorporate into the investment decisions that right now, frankly, they're not because they're so time constrained, right? And so the perception for the most part in the asset management industry that ESG or responsible investing, all of these factors are secondary, right? And they really need to spend their time of looking at kind of core fundamentals, things that will drive earnings. They don't have time for other crap, and it's all fluff, and it's all just marketing, right? So kind of speeding up the research process also have this auxiliary benefit of it actually gives them time to look at this non-financial risks and hopefully makes the world a better place through better alignment, also in this case of how funds flow in the world to actual social good. um, and so for me the company seemed like this really really nice win-win. Like we have this it had this technology wave coming that could create a ton of value commercially, but also actually do some social good, ironically, by servicing the world of asset management, perhaps slightly ironically.
Yeah, I was gonna say very cool. And do you guys work with quants at all? You mentioned quants. Are you like who's your target customer today?
So we work across both fundamental and quantitative folks, but for the most part, our kind of core audience is fundamental investors, and it's a bigger market, right? Ultimately, just if you can add value to, especially the most sophisticated fundamental investors in the world, some of which we work with, then you can add value to a lot of folks who are doing the stuff by hand.
Yeah, interesting. And so how does your software work exactly, right? So how do you then provide the end research, particularly around non-fundamental items, right? So like I
Mhm.
imagine if you're doing market research for a company in say oil and gas, maybe the wrong example, but then you have a lot of history, you have a lot of data,
Mhm.
but you have maybe less data on employees being mistreated, for instance, right? So how do you make that
Mhm.
distinction?
Yeah, so I mean, there's two sources of information for this sort of stuff, really, right? It's what has the company said in their disclosures, right? So either in their financial reports or in their ESG reports, and then external data. Is there something in the news? Is there something in social media? Is there something on Glassdoor that you can find to at least infer? Okay, like it is there an indication that something negative is happening, right? And most of the time there is, right? Even before like with something like what happened with Activision, for example, right? They had a big labor controversy, not so good culture that eventually ended up being something that really cost the company and kind of blew things up. Um, Before this was huge, before it was out there in New York Times, there was a lot of chatter around it, right? So people on social media saying, "Hey, by the way, it's a really crappy place to work." Not something investors would pay attention to, but it was out there in the ether, right? Kind of this needle in a haystack stuff, and that's exactly the value that we provide, right? Alerting someone to that early and saying, "Hey, by the way." okay, so maybe there isn't like a giant explosion around this, but actually there's enough stuff for us to infer that maybe this company is actually riskier than you might think, and you may want to pay attention to this.
Yeah, it seems like such a big market too, right? So how do you then decide like what to focus on initially, right? So like how do you find your first customers? How do you get to the famous product market fit?
Yeah. So for us, being a Canadian company, right, we really grew through partnerships early on. So what we are doing is really hard, right? Like it's bona fide tech, right? It's not straightforward how to do this really well at a large enough scale. For all the companies out there, without a white list, right, in a repeatable, completely automated fashion, where an investor can just log into our app and do this research, and have basically all this information, served up to them, distilled, so that it's quite fast for them to go through what otherwise, would be completely intractable. Um, and so, in order to fill this technology gap, we worked with partners, right? So instead of raising venture capital or a bunch of angel funding, we instead said, well, okay, let's find the right partners for us to build out our technology earlier on. And to your point about product market fit, it also helps, right? Because if you're working with someone sophisticated enough, who can help, afford to take on the risk, and is forward looking enough to work with a really early stage company, then they're probably also a good measuring stick to say, well, can we add value to a lot of other people because they're building this technology, co-developing this technology with us, and providing their insight and their needs and their requirements, when they already have access to their entire market, right? And they would have bought a product that already exists if it served their particular needs.
Yeah, it's fascinating. So why not the venture path? Like, is it something just for now, or is it a sense of
So
like
we
you
we
have
are
revenue?
actually raising, right? So right now we're at the point where we are actively raising our seed. Hopefully we'll close it, relatively soon. Earlier on, honestly, there's not a ton of appetite in Canada, right? I think for our type of business, right? Like something that has a lot of technology risk, or at least Canada is very bifurcated, right? So we will every once in a while throw boatload of money at like an Element AI and do something really really bold, for a success story on that front, maybe someone like a Cohere, for example, right? um, but most of the time, right, you really need to show traction for Canadian investors to get interested, right? And so for us, right, because we it's not the type of business where it's like, okay, you can like hire a development agency and spend 30K and have an MVP out there and start showing growth, right? We really did have a technology problem to solve upfront before we could start showing, okay, our usage growing, and more and more clients and pilots closing, etc. So we had to get creative around how to solve that technology problem. And so for us, it was growth through partnerships.
Yeah, maybe I'll throw you a question of left field, and feel free to disregard. But I was watching actually yesterday an interesting interview with Sam Altman, obviously from
Mhm.
OpenAI, which was I think just from this week, and he was asked a question of what does he think is going to be one of the most successful companies or types of companies that will emerge
Mm.
because of this nascent developments, right? And he mentioned like a new type of RenTech, right? Renaissance Technologies, which is
Mm.
famously
Mhm.
a quant fund that like does a lot of the advanced stuff that we were talking about before. Have you ever considered, well, using our technology, we can be like a platform like Rentec for
Mm.
more traditional investors, right? That want to get into that world,
Mhm.
use your models basically to be able to figure out where
Mm.
there's, like some alpha and invest. I don't know, maybe it's completely off my idea, but I'd like to hear you.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think it kind of boils down to, do you want to be a Renaissance Technologies, or do you want to be a Bloomberg? Um, right. So, and for us, we want to be a Bloomberg, right? Because either you're running your own money, and it's very difficult to sell to other asset managers there, because they're super secretive and they're highly competitive and they don't want to talk to you, right? If you are an asset manager yourself, right? Or you really are a technology company, right? And you say, okay, well, like we won't we don't like you don't need to be so worried about IP leakage to us, because at the end of the day, we are not investors, right? We just service everyone, and we have really good stuff. So, I mean, if you don't buy our stuff, but your competitors do, then you're really at an inherent disadvantage. And asset management in that sense is interesting, because it's also just like a winner takes all market, right? Like everybody has a Bloomberg terminal, right? Is because otherwise they just feel you're not competitive, right? So it's an interesting kind of market where it's like difficult to sell into, But on the other hand, it has this very winners takes all property where, like, if you have a big enough edge and your stuff is really the best out there, then everyone eventually feels like they need to have it, right? And so for us, really going the technology company route just seemed much more attractive than looking to become an asset manager.
Yeah, you're becoming like a platform, for instance. But again,
Mhm.
maybe the idea is then become that platform that helps other companies become themselves, like a Rentec, for instance, right? Just considering how easy you're going to be
Mhm.
able to, I would say easy, maybe is the wrong word here, but like how scalable it'll become.
Yeah, well, I think the basic part of this is just, yeah, like just supercharging the fundamental investor is how I think about it, right? Because you have, obviously Rentec, right? Like they're the quant fund. Um, there's this concept in finance of like quantamental investing, right? So a mix of just, fundamental or discretionary research, right? Which, like humans doing it, and quantitative research, right? And I think there's a big convergence towards this. Like quants are becoming more fundamental, have been for a while, because natural language processing is getting better. So some of these ideas that historically would be very much in the human domain and, like relied on unstructured data that computers weren't so good at reading, as computers get better and better at reading it, right? You can have these quantitative or systematic strategies that are much more like a human doing it, right? And on the other hand, fundamental investors are getting much more sophisticated by being enabled with better technology, becoming more aware of quantitative tools and, scenario analysis, and incorporating factor investing into their process, right? So there's this kind of convergence, and I think with how good AI is getting, what we are going to start seeing is these boundaries are really going to start breaking down, right? And so then, these next generation rentechs are, I think, going to be not a purely fundamental shop, not a purely quant shop, right? Or a shop that has like desks that are like, this is the nerd desk of quantitative investors, right? And this is the fundamental desk, but something that's much more of a hybrid approach. I think this is where we will get. And of course, yeah, tooling like ours is what's going to enable for that to happen.
Yeah, just like how the best chess players today are, AIs plus people, right? So it's a little bit similar in that approach. Do you have a broader vision for Responsibly today? I know that you said you're still, like you're raising a seed. There still seems so much green space in front of you in terms of what you're
Mhm.
building. But have you thought about a little bit of how big you can take your company?
Yeah, of course, right? Like you always think about it as a founder. For what we're doing, the market is massive, right? So like there's definitely room for us to be, to be unicorn, to, to 10x, and maybe 10x even a couple of times after we do become one. And, as an entrepreneur, I think not having that drive to take it as far as you can take it, it's hard to be successful, right? Like you really need to have, kind of like this burning energy for it. I do think that, there's absolutely that opportunity for us. It, just a simple way of like looking at our market in particular, right? And even, well, just the buy side of, so like without investment banking and stuff like that, and there's a ton of automation opportunity on that front of things. But there's something like 300,000 fundamental analysts in the world. They're generally super highly paid, and frankly, as of right now, probably like about half of their work is inefficient work. So the research they do, the modeling that they do, right? So like turning the stuff they read into these fundamental models that live in Excel in terms of how the company is valued and how it will evolve in the future. A lot of that work is just not efficient right now. It can be enabled by technology, and we can shave off a lot of the inefficiency that currently exists, right? And the pie there is a multi-billion-dollar pie, right? It's a massive business. What I would say, to the point of what are the best businesses that are going to be created on top of large language models and these foundational technologies. And this, by the way, like there's also discussion, right, of like, is it going to be like an oligopoly of like OpenAI and maybe a handful of others, or are things going to be more commoditized? Is open source, like is Hugging Face going to be the place where you go for large language models eventually? I think there's a big question mark there, but regardless, we're going to have some foundational layer, right? Be it more open source or be it an oligopoly. And then you're going to have companies like ours that are building these industry specific solutions that are sufficiently sticky because they require other types of interfaces and maybe other integrations with different types of technologies, that aren't just a straightforward application of an LLM, um, where you can re-envision some business process that is common and sufficiently large, and create an industry specific solution on top of the stack. I think these are going to be some really powerful businesses, right? Outside of course, the foundational models, the foundational model providers, right? Provided we stay in this kind of oligopoly world.
Yeah, I think I can't speak to the point of who's going to win. My quick perspective is I don't know much about the infrastructure layer. Is going to be open source? Is going to be kind of like the cloud players, but probably like you mentioned at the application layer, there's going to be tons of companies, right? So the
Hmm.
analogy is infrastructure is like AWS, GCP, Azure. They're going to dominate. Most likely, it's going to end up that way. But then on sitting on top of them, there's going to be a bunch of companies like yours that just
Hmm.
from the ground up are taking advantage of these types of technologies, which I find is super exciting. And maybe a question on more on the personal front, now 2.5 years since you started the company, what's been most surprising to you on this journey?
Yeah, there's probably a couple of things, right? So for other founders or anyone thinking of starting up a business, I think just the emotional management of it all has been a big learning, right? I came from from consulting, from venture capital. Like when I started the company, I was like, okay, everybody tells me this stuff is really stressful, but I have really good stress management and really good ways of compartmentalizing, right? Like my emotional game is pretty on point. And it was a huge adjustment, and it still is a huge adjustment because it's true what they say. It's a giant roller coaster, right? Like professionally, the highs are definitely higher than when I had a job, but the lows are also very low, and just but also like it's your job to be as kind of steadfast and as put together through it all because there's a lot of people relying on you, right? So you're kind of like in this place where you're just taking on like sort of probably the most stress you could ever take on professionally, and stress that's not the same to manage as just like I have too many projects and too much work, right? There's also just like other kinds of stress and other kinds of uncertainty, but you have to learn to be okay with it, right? So and then I think on the other end of it, like as of right now, I'm the happiest at work that I've ever been by far. And it's still not always easy, but I just get so much fulfillment out of what I'm doing, that it definitely makes all of it worth it, right? And then there's just a million little learnings in terms of like running a business, as a small team, especially right at our stage. You're kind of doing everything, right? So as CEO, I wear a lot of different hats. So there's been just a ton of kind of professional development and learning, and it's been quite fascinating as well. Again, just like they say, consulting is a place where you learn a lot and very quickly, and that's still very true, I think, compared to a lot of other jobs. But I've learned and grew way faster, right, in these last couple of years than I think I ever have. So um, highly recommended, despite maybe sounding kind of like a bit more early on in this answer.
Right. It sounds like you're just getting started, man. And I think some very good life lessons. I can't think of a better way to kind of end the interview. I think very wise words from you, Alik. Maybe a final question, and not to hump on the AI, like drum too much. I think it gets overplayed sometimes. But beyond AI or including it, like what are you most excited about? Let's say in the next few years, be it in your industry or more just more broadly.
It's still sort of a consequence of AI, but I am quite excited about what the future of work looks like. I mean, both excited and a little bit worried, right? Because it is such a double edged sword. But we are in a place where so many things that are crappy are all of a sudden, like at least for knowledge work, right? Like so just so much of the kind of darker side of knowledge work, these really mundane things, are going away, right? And so that means that like at our best, right, if we respond well to this transition, um, I think that the jobs that my kids might have are going to be awesome, right? So wrapping around this new technology, right? I think the future of work looks really amazing, right? The downside of it is going to be a big wave where a lot of stuff that people have been spending a lot of time on is going to become unnecessary, right? And so how we transition around that, but so just the amount of creativity that I think we're unlocking now, that we're going to be unlocking in the coming years, is truly amazing. And I do hope, I'm very hopeful that we will see the kind of future where it it does spur more innovation and more um, more risk taking, more people just solving problems, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Right. Yeah, it's going to be fascinating regardless, and probably it's in certain spots it'll be a rocky ride, but I'm excited about the future and just seeing how everything will unfold. And whatever we saw in our lifetimes in terms of like rate of progress, I think it's gonna feel like nothing changed in comparison to the next decade or so.
I think so. I think so. Yeah, it's super exciting, right? I found this interesting analogy of like someone was born that's in 1880 and died in like 1960. They saw like the
Mhm.
advent of like electricity, trains, planes, nuclear energy, and all these things. But then someone in like 1980, kind of like me, it's like it seems kind of the same. Like if you remove the laptops
Mhm.
and phones, it's kind of hasn't changed much. And to your point, it's like if you look back in history, you look at this milestone of this year, you're like, wow, like holy crap, like this is kind of where shit is going to get really cool. So I think it's a great place to wrap up, Alik. And
Mhm.
final question: if people want to learn, follow your journey and what you guys are building, what's the best way?
Our website, responsibly.ai, responsibly with an I, is a good place. My personal LinkedIn, our company's LinkedIn, we put out updates pretty consistently. Anybody who'd like to connect, right? Just add me on LinkedIn. Always happy to chat. Of course, if everyone's interesting, in our product, kind of seeing, what we've built, how it can help with their investment process. I'm also always more than happy to demonstrate.
It's cool. Thank you so much for your time today.
Yeah, likewise. Thank you for having me. This has been a blast.
As always, thanks for listening, and don't forget to subscribe. If you want to learn more, check out thepnr.com.